IKEA, Hockey, Ericsson, H&M, Volvo, Electrolux, and Moose. That's just about sums all of the Kingdom of Sweden that I was familiar with. Embarrassingly, not very much. But I just found out some very interesting things about the third largest country in Europe. In 2014, Sweden celebrated 200 years of peace, meaning that it's been 2 centuries since the country adopted a policy of neutrality, breaking even Switzerland's record. Sweden has a population of 10.3 million people, but interestingly, and somewhat surprisingly, 2.5 million of those, almost a quarter, have a foreign background. Now, the definition of that is which anyone who is either foreign-born or born in Sweden with foreign parents. We're going to find out what it's like to be one of those 2.5 million people. Today, we go to Sweden. My guest today is Lacey Yeo-Carlsson. Lacey originally visited Sweden in 2009, met her future partner, and like so many, ended up moving there in 2010 to pursue love. Lacey, welcome to the Canadian Expat.
Thanks so much.
Now, you're originally from PEI. I'm guessing that things are very different where you are now.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah. I'm also living in a small town here, and I'm from a small town, Summerside. It's virtually the same population, but lifestyle is quite different here compared to there.
I bet. Can you describe the community of, now it's Krylbo, right?
Krylbo.
Krylbo, sorry.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a suburb of the bigger community called Avesta. And it's located about an hour and a half northwest of Stockholm. Population about 15,000 people. And exactly like you said in the introduction, a lot of diverse backgrounds here in Krylbo. It's a small town.
So what about things like the cost of living? How does that differ from Sweden, in particular your community, to where you're from in PEI?
I find that the cost of living in Sweden is more. I mean, we have a higher tax rate here, but I find that we do get a lot for the tax dollars itself. Cost of living as far as rent, I think is very comparable actually to how it is on PEI nowadays. Food is a higher tax on it, so it costs more money. Clothing and that kind of stuff is a higher cost on virtually everything that you have. But we get a lot back for that money as far as healthcare and kids having free lunch at school every day. And I'm in the education field. That's why I'm kind of using that as an example. But, there's just a lot of things that are comparable to Canada, of course, too. Good roads, just good quality of life in general. We have here universal childcare, that kind of thing, which I know is something that a lot of Canadians would like to see there too. But yeah, it's a good quality of living, although taxes are higher.
Right. What about your work? I know that you're working in the education field. You just mentioned that. Can you describe a little bit about where you work and what your average day would look like? Does it differ from what it might look like here in Canada?
Yeah. Being a teacher here in Sweden is very different than it is in Canada. I worked as a teacher in Canada for 1 year before I moved back to Sweden in 2010. The education system, it looks different than it did in the mid 90s, which a lot of Canadians probably have, we were used to hearing about the Swedish education system, but the state actually ended up giving the education system to the communities, like individual communities, to run based on one, like a curriculum that is state kind of driven. So we've lost a little bit of the consistency. I work at a school called INTERNATIONELLA SKOLAN, or the International English School. And I find that system is a lot more kind of British-based Canadian background. We're known as Mr. and Miss, whatever our last name is. And, just the kind of like routines and the disciplinarian part of it and that kind of stuff is very similar. I spent a couple of years working in a Swedish school. And there's so much in the news about this now, is how it almost feels like there's this kind of, it's hard to find a balance between the role of the teacher and the role of the student nowadays. It's with the change that happened about 20 years ago, it happened to be that like, it almost feels like the teachers are more of kind of like a mentor role as opposed to like an authority figure. So the teachers are called by their first names. I would be known as Lacey as opposed to Miss Yeo-Carlsson. And it's more like, based around the student as opposed to like just teaching out a curriculum. It's different than it is at home. We have virtually all over Sweden, a teacher is in the classroom for 18 hours a week. And then about 16 to 18 more hours on top of that is given as planning time, which you don't have in Canada. Teachers go home in the evenings and plan, or elementary school teachers hardly have enough time to eat their lunch and that kind of stuff. And that's not at all how it is here. The unions are really strong here for teachers to not take work home. That's a big difference.
Very interesting. Now, I know that you had mentioned previously that there are some Canadians that, like yourself, go from Canada to Sweden to teach. Is it a requirement then that they're able to speak Swedish?
Not if you're going to work in the private school like I work in now. Math, science, English, and all of the domestic science. Home economics, I think it's called at home. Those kind of subjects are like the hands-on subjects. Those are all taught in English. And then the Swedish speakers then teach like kind of your social studies and your Swedish language and that kind of stuff. But if you were going to work in the Swedish school system, then the language would be a requirement for you to have at least an understanding. If you were teaching English, okay, you probably don't have to communicate in Swedish, but all the staff meetings and all that kind of stuff would have to be done in the Swedish language. So you'd have to have that as a background. So
for a Canadian, perhaps teacher or some other field that's planning to go to Sweden, any advice?
Yeah, good question. I had a pretty light transition, like an easy transition in, because I was together with a Swede when I moved here. So he kind of, showed me the ropes and that kind of stuff. But certainly the language, it is a national requirement that Swedes have a certain level of English before they can even like graduate from grade 9 kind of thing. So the English language isn't very difficult for the Swedes here. They'll understand everything. One thing, which is the biggest difference I noticed from home, is that Swedes are very reserved people. So they're not very gregarious, or they're not kind of in your face like Canadians can be very. And you don't even notice that when you're living at home in Canada, but when you leave, you're like, wow, maybe it wasn't okay to just sit next to that person on the bus when they, that kind of thing. So they'll always help. I've noticed this. They'll always help you if you ask for it. Very friendly when you get to know them, but otherwise, it's kind of like head down in the street. They don't say hi when you meet them on the, when you're walking down the road or something. And so that was the biggest difference I found, was kind of like knowing the border or not, like the boundary. Yeah.
Those cultural differences can always be a little bit tricky, right? Regardless of where you move to the world. There's differences everywhere. So it's interesting to hear what sort of differences there are in Sweden.
Yeah. And one thing that I also learned in Sweden, and this was really interesting, is that there's actually there's a lot of like unwritten laws in Sweden that you kind of learn as you go along. And one of them is, it's something called Jantelagen, which means that you are not to think that you're any better than anybody else, kind of thing. So there is absolutely no gloating or bragging or anything like that. And it's really looked down upon if you were to do something like that. Not that it's an unwritten rule in Canada. I don't find, at least the Canadians that I've met living abroad, they aren't so braggy or anything like that either. But some cultures are very much like that. And it is a big culture difference in Sweden for people to think don't think that you're anything more than, anybody else kind of thing.
When you look out your window in the morning, what do you see?
Yeah, it's very dark in Sweden this time of year. So when you look out your window in the morning, you don't see very much. But when the light eventually comes in, we live in a subdivision here, very similar to what you would have at home. The houses are maybe not as extravagant as the ones that I'm maybe accustomed to at home, but we have neighbors, very multicultural here where I live in Krylbo. We have a nice yard with deer that come by to say hi and that kind of thing.
So it sounds very similar to what you would find in most rural towns in Canada.
Yeah, the nature is very, very similar to, if we're driving through New Brunswick, you could easily be driving through my route to work on the train every day kind of thing. It's very similar.
Anything else that you might suggest to somebody that's going to want to move to Sweden?
I'm not sure. Sweden is desperate for teachers. I'm not sure exactly how it looks in Canada now, but a lot of the positions where you work with people, police officers, teachers, nurses, that kind of thing, where we're in a very, very high demand for those professions. And with the opportunity to teach at these English schools that I've talked about, that I work at now, we have 20, I think 3 of them now in the country. But if you're a teacher and you're watching this right now, I strongly suggest, and you have an interest in Scandinavia, I really would encourage you to apply, look us up and apply, because we're desperate. The whole country is crying for teachers. So
perfect. I'll put a link in the description of the video to your school. You can provide that to me and I'll make sure that it gets out there as well. Lacey, thank you so much for joining us.
Nope. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do. We'd love to see you. Until next time.